Thanks for joining me in this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism. Today's guest is Dr. Bruce Levine, who has been involved with advocacy for change. He has a PhD in clinical psychology and is the author of 5 books. The most recent is A Profession Without Reason, The Crisis of Contemporary Psychiatry, Untangled and Solved by Spinoza, Freethinking, and the Radical Enlightenment. It was just released last year, as I understand it. And Bruce was kind enough to grant me an interview, and I hope we can have some interesting discussion. I did grab one sentence off of your website that said, Bruce E. Levine writes and speaks widely on how society, culture, politics, and psychology intersect. And I thought that was a great summary of the work you do.
Well, thanks. Yep, that's what I try to do. Yeah, and I've had an interest not just in psychology pretty much my whole life here, but also politics and history and philosophy, and all of these things intersect. And of all the major problems of psychiatry, of which there are so many colossal, obvious problems of big pharma corruption and on, that sometimes the more interesting omissions of psychiatry aren't talked about, and that's one that people for years have understood. This is not this discrete, separate thing, this psychiatry, psychology thing. All of these things, they go together.
They all interweave. And that, and you already mentioned some of the big things. One of the comments, one of the things you just said was the omissions. And just even with what I do, I've really learned to look at what's being left out of a conversation or what's being not discussed is very important. And so the first question is, like I say, I do want to talk about the book as we continue, but just, you mentioned you use the word colossal problems. What are the biggest problems you see with psychiatry, psychology, mental health, some of the struggle that people face, both in terms of family, people seeking help, as you see it?
Well, I would say the biggest problem of psychiatry, at least of establishment psychiatry, and I always want to say there are dissonant psychiatrists who are incredibly embarrassed by their field, but the mainstream establishment psychiatry, by that I mean the American Psychiatric Association, the Guild of American Psychiatrists, and so on. And the biggest problem is that they're completely a failure. I mean, and this is not the words really of radical, critical thinkers out there. This is even themselves. This is Thomas Insel. You can't be more establishment psychiatry than the former director of National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, who was longtime director, who's called the outcomes bleak and abysmal. I mean, looking at suicidality and hospitalizations, everything out there. And then you look at their other major failure, which is their whole theory of mental illness. It's finally, we've known since the 1990s, researchers have known there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance, low levels of serotonin creating depression and high levels of dopamine creating schizophrenia. This is widely known, but of course, psychiatry and drug companies didn't want the word to get out. But finally, through the work most recently through Joanna Moncrief's article that went mainstream about this relationship, that there was no relationship between serotonin levels and depression. Finally, this has entered the mainstream. But even Insel talked about that in his 2022 book, admitted there is no chemical imbalance theory of depression. The third area, which is their diagnostic manual, that again, going to Insel again, the director of psychiatry at NIMH from 2002 to 2015, said way back over 10 years ago that this thing is invalid, and he tried to jettison this thing, but there was a political infighting with the American Psychiatric Association, who makes a lot of money off of this DSM publication. So you're talking about 3 big areas that establishment psychiatry, one of the leading figures, Insel, the outcome failure, DSM failure, the chemical imbalance theory failure. So really, we can talk about a lot more other interesting failures that they won't acknowledge, but at the get-go, you're talking about a colossal failure of an institution. And here's the other interesting thing for me, is that one of the things that psychiatry uses, one of their labels, one of their terms to describe the most severe symptom of the seriously mentally ill is something they call agnosia, right? I can't even pronounce this thing. ANSO, what ANSGI, nosognosia. What they mean by that is you're mentally ill, which is bad enough, but you have no insight into the fact that you're mentally ill, right? So you're really seriously mentally ill, which is, so for me, the funny thing is that we have a classic projection, I guess is what you call it, in that psychiatry has this anosognosia itself about a complete lack of insight, that all their failures have to do with the fact that their basic model, their basic paradigm is wrong. But they have this lack of insight about that. So we could go on, but the whole profession of psychiatry out there at one level is, as I was saying, a tragedy, but also a comedy. I don't know, depending on what kind of mood you're in, how you want to look at it. But that's where we're at. And so, what happens to a lot of folks who are psychiatry critics, dissident psychiatrists, dissident psychologists, journalists, ex-patients, psychiatric survivors, is that there's so many obvious problematic things wrong with it. We could get kind of boring talking about them because the world still is not getting it. I mean, most of the world's still not getting that there's no chemical imbalance theory of mental illness, even though it's now been out in the mainstream. So we have to spend so much time talking about these colossal errors of commission that we don't talk about some of the more interesting things. And so that's part of why I wrote that, A Profession Without Reason, to try to kind of make this whole field a little more interesting again.
We could spend an hour just dissecting what you just said because there's so many parts that overlap with my own experience. The part about the comedy or the tragedy, that there were even times, I mean, I know you're aware I went through what I've always called a severe stress breakdown back in 1998. And in some ways, it was a comedy of errors that I ran into. And of course, all that did was traumatize me worse. So just having someone in the profession or in the industry, not psychiatry, but as a PhD psychologist, recognizing that is very validating for people like me. So, and you mentioned Thomas Insel, and this was something I think I picked up on an article from Mad in America. I didn't realize that he first began criticizing or critiquing the outcomes like 10, 11 years ago in 2013, wasn't it?
Right. That quote about it being abysmal and bleak is from over 10 years ago. I think he mentioned it in a couple interviews, and it was in Gary Greenberg's book of Woe. And so it's been in several places for quite some time. And he said a lot of things that were highly critical of psychiatry, which, but he's backed off some of those things. But the things about the bleak outcomes, he hasn't backed off on. He doesn't talk as much about the DSM being invalid, but he hasn't backed off of that. One thing he stopped talking about, he actually even went as far after I know you had Robert Whitaker on, and he talked about the Martin Harrow study, and he may or may not have talked about the Wondering study, which all of these showing that people who were off medication in the long term follow-ups did better than people who were on medication. He even was aware of that insult, and he talked about maybe we have to rethink how we're treating people who are diagnosed with this thing called schizophrenia. Maybe some people are better off without the medication. But he backed off that completely. He didn't mention a word of that in his recent 2022 book, which he calls Healing, even though the book has nothing to do with healing, but he called it Healing. And he actually backs off, and he even trashes Robert Whitaker in there obnoxiously, which is, but for a while. Right. I mean, I think the big thing that people have to understand about all of these characters like Thomas Insel, presidents of the American Psychiatric Association, you get to these high levels not because you're brilliant, or certainly not because you're a scientist, brilliant scientist. You get to those levels because you're politicians. And so anytime that establishment psychiatry is acknowledging anything that people in the Mad in America orbit or in other kind of critical psychiatry, critical psychology thinkers orbit is like they're acknowledging it because it's already gotten out there enough that they're going to look bad if they don't at least acknowledge it. So they're willing to compromise a little and put that out, but then put out a whole bunch of other bullshit. Their major bullshit will always be psychiatry is a young science that's making great progress. Right? Yeah. Oh yeah, we didn't get that right, but we're making progress. And this is complete bullshit. You can't really find one scientific area where there's any progress at all.
So to me, let me back up just for a minute, because I'm still developing my audience, and we mentioned the DSM, and I want to make sure people understand what that is. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders. Is that
correct? Correct. So
yeah.
the DSM.
And basically how it was created is it wasn't really based on science that much. It was based on collaboration and voting in terms of
Right.
yeah.
So the most obvious example of what you just said was the DSM, when the DSM-3, 1980, DSM-4, 1994, DSM-5 in 2013. And each time there's a committee. And again, as I said earlier, the American Psychiatric Association, which is the Guild of American Psychiatrists, they publish this thing. It's their big money maker. And so it's just a group of big shot politically astute psychiatrists who sit around and they try to guess what behaviors out there, what phenomenon get them uptight. If it gets them really uptight, it's a serious mental illness. If it gets them a little uptight, it's not so serious. But they're always kind of adjusting culturally and politically. And so the most famous example of this is that they had homosexuality was a mental illness all the way through the early 1970s, and it would have kept on going on as a mental illness, except for the fact that gay activists protested and they got this abolished in 1973. And so, as I almost always try to talk about, is that this is a big event because not only was it a victory for gay activists, but on a bigger level, that's why in the 1970s, it was so obvious to so many people that you cannot protest and abolish cancer or diabetes. You can't do that. So if you can protest and abolish something as a mental illness, this cannot be like a scientific disease in the same sense that all these other real medical diseases are. So it's real important for the people to understand how things come in and go out, mostly come into the DSM. It's all about a vote of big shot, psychiatrists at the American Psychiatric Association. So it's a completely political it's a political activity based on their assumptions about our culture and our society.
Well, a few years ago, I read both Paula Kaplan's book, They Say You're Crazy, and James Davies' book, Cracked, where he talks about the process. And I was stunned that there wasn't more data supporting things. And of course, for me, I have a master's in statistics. And the fact that that S in DSM stands for statistical really ticks me off.
It's a joke. One of their biggest lies, okay, was when they came out with, everybody kind of knew this thing wasn't valid. So again, I mean, I know you're hip to this, but what for a lot of maybe in your audience, what's the difference between validity and reliability, which are two key parts of science, right? So validity means does anything just even mean anything? So the famous example in history of invalidity was something called drapetomania, that some slave, some doctor in Louisiana wanted to say that slaves who were running away from plantations, they must have a mental illness. That's why they're running away. They can't be running away for freedom, and dignity. No, they're running away because they have some mental illness, and he called this drapetomania. So clearly, I would hope almost everybody out there says, well, that's invalid. That's not really an illness. Okay, so that's validity, invalidity. But reliability means just is just even if you believe in all of these DSM diagnoses, you believe in there's something called attention deficit disorder, you believe there's something called oppositional defiance disorder, that really is an illness, that kids who argue too much, kids who don't comply with adult authorities, these really are, even if you believe all of this stuff, they can't reliably assess it, which means that if you take the same person and go to different clinicians, you get different assessments of different diagnoses, maybe no diagnoses at all. And that's the case. The big lie was when DSM-3 came out was they were just told everybody, well, this is reliable. We've got these behavioral checklists, so it's reliable. Well, it wasn't. And people like Cutchins and Kirk and their book about the DSM, they talked about this over 15, 20 years ago. They talked about this. And even when the DSM-5 came out, even again, one of these establishment psychiatrists who's become somewhat of a critic, Alan Francis, said, if you look at what the statistic is, the kappa statistic that indicates high reliability and low reliability, and it was incredibly low reliability. And so even for example, in DSM-4, one of the big diagnoses, how you diagnose somebody who's schizophrenic is if they have bizarre delusions. That was a big thing. Well, they did a study and they asked 50 senior psychiatrists what their definition of bizarre was, and they couldn't agree.
couldn't
Which
agree.
again, so you're talking about language, you're talking about words, and so of course you could just, anybody with some sense, should be able to just even intuit that this is not going to be a reliable kind of instrument, and it is not.
Right. No, it's fascinating because you mentioned how some people don't diagnose. And that actually happened to me first when I returned back to the US. The first PhD psychotherapist wouldn't diagnose me with anything, but I desperately needed to get on a medical leave.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I had to start from scratch trying to find someone else. And so that's one of the kind of comedy of errors. And once I learned what the DSM was, I was like, he could have opened that up and twirled his finger around and just said, do you want to have that? And I would have said, will it get me on a medical leave? And I didn't know what the DSM was at the time. So, and that was 25 years ago, So basically, what I can tell just from my side of things, it seems like the general public hasn't gotten the memo that the model isn't good, the DSM is critiqued. I still run into people who are like, well, this is a biochemical imbalance. and so how do you are we making progress in getting the general public to know that? Or I know, and I think so, because there are other conversations where people are like, oh yeah, there's problems there. But I just wanted your take as someone who's been working in the industry.
Yeah, I think it's a great question that at one level, that we're making no progress because a lot of the general public still believes all of these things because they've heard it 1,000 times. When, it's just, again, from when, in propaganda, if somebody hears something 1,000 times, I've told people 20 years ago this chemical imbalance theory was untrue. Friends I've told them 3, 4, 5 times, and then the big study came out in 2022 and they said, hey, Bruce, and I go, wait a minute, I told you this 15, 20 years ago. And it's just one of those things, if you hear something so much, from the other side, you sort of become, as the great scientist Carl Sagan once said, you get attached to them bamboozle. You get attached to them
Right.
bamboozle. And it's hard to give it up. So I think a lot of primary care doctors, I don't know, I haven't seen any kind of surveys or polls. It would be interesting to see how many of them still buy into this chemical imbalance theory. So at some level, in general society, in the mainstream media, they are still buying into a lot of these notions. But I think at another level, a lot thanks to the kind of Robert Whitaker's work in Mad in America, a lot thanks to some dissident psychiatrists like Joanna Moncrief, a lot thanks to like stronger and stronger psychiatric survivor movements, that there is like more, I would think, a core, like it doesn't take much for people who are like exploring the internet to looking for some dissident critical views, because psychiatry and the whole mental health profession hasn't helped them. It's easier for them to find some alternative views out there. So on one level, it's encouraging. There's more, like I find more and more, like right now, again, the internet, I'm able to do podcasts with critical thinkers, just, a lot of real interesting folks, who in their 30s and their 40s, Gen Xers, millennials, they're interested in this stuff. And so that some of these folks have a real significant audience. So there's on the one hand, some real encouraging things at one level, but at a general societal level, it's pretty discouraging. But I could say that about a lot of things in society.
Yeah, can't we though? Yeah, no, I was just kind of curious about that because for me, it does seem like there is at least a movement building for saying, hey, we're not doing this correctly in the last 40 or 50 years. And for me, my experience had to do a lot with what Stanislav Grof, Czech psychiatrist, would call non-ordinary states of consciousness. And they were doing a better job with that back in the 60s and 70s. And of course, some of them were still doing their work into the 80s and 90s. But, so that's part of why I want to get in on the discussion and say, this would have helped me. This didn't, as someone who has that lived experience. So let's take a few moments and talk about the book. I mean, I really appreciated the book. And one of the first questions, so let me ask you, first off, you mentioned Spinoza in the subtitle. Could you give us a brief background of who Spinoza was?
Sure. Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza was a Dutch philosopher born in 1632, died young guy in 1677. And the first thing that's real important for people to understand is when you talk about somebody being a philosopher in that era, it's sort of a little bit different than nowadays, where people just think, well, they just cared about things like metaphysics and epistemology and theories of knowledge and theories of being. And that back in that era, if you were a philosopher, you cared about everything. You cared about wisdom. So he cared about science. He did scientific studies himself. He actually, part of the way he made a living was to grind lenses. He cared a lot about optics, so he ground lenses and he polished lenses for microscopes and telescopes. He cared a lot about what we call psychology today. I mean, his magnum opus, something called the Ethics. It's really a kind of a fun. It's not so fun, easy to read. We can talk about why it's difficult for most people to read later, but the substance of it is a lot of like more interesting cognitive psychology than at least the last three sections. It's a 5-section book. The last three sections of it is how to liberate yourself from your kind of problematic emotions. It's some interesting stuff there. The other stuff that he was really interested in, he was also interested in a lot in the relationship between theological authorities and politics. And so there's a lot of different angles why I thought he would be an interesting lens, an interesting foil to take a look at psychiatry. But one of the ones that there's some of those chapters in that book I didn't know I was going to write until I got deeper and deeper into Spinoza. But the one I knew I was going to write was a chapter called Two Bibles, because as we talked about, the DSM is commonly referred to in psychiatry as the diagnostic Bible. And so it's important for a lot of us who are critics to delegitimize the science of it, because we know that if people believe that this thing is scientific, the psychiatrists and all these folks who are supposedly the experts, and it gives them a lot of power in society. So the parallel with Spinoza's era was that in those days, the big thing that had a lot of power was the Bible. And if the clergy could convince everybody that this was the word of God and that they were the best interpreters of this word of God, then they had enormous power. And Spinoza and his friends did not like that at all, because what they cared most about was freedom, and certainly freedom of speech, freedom of thought. And to the extent that this clergy authority class had the power in society to shut them up, that pissed him off. And so that was why he wrote that book in 1670, so 7 years before his death, called the Theological Political Treatise. And it got him in a lot of trouble. He actually wrote it. He published it anonymously. They tried to, fake the publisher, the location, but word got out the Spinoza guy wrote it. And for the rest of his life, he was an object of surveillance. And it made it impossible for him to actually publish his magnum opus, the Ethics, in his lifetime. He had to depend on his friends after he died to publish that. So there's a lot of reasons why I knew from even before I sat down to write this book that I thought Spinoza would be an interesting way of making this increasingly boring field called psychiatry like fun for people who ordinarily wouldn't read about it. I run into a lot of people who are critical thinkers in politics and philosophy and history, who go, this psychiatry stuff, it just bores the hell out of them, because they sense it's kind of a dogma. And it's like not a fun one. And so part of what I was trying to do is try to get those folks who are interested in those things to take a fresh look at psychiatry. And so there were these obvious reasons I knew in the beginning that Spinoza would be relevant. But then as we move along, I discovered some other chapters that there was no way when I began this quest that I thought I would write, but they became some of the more fun chapters for me.
Oh, that sounds like quite a process. I mean, that must have been interesting for you to realize, oh, gee, I need to explore this more and explore that more and develop it out. I appreciated the chapters. I thought were well laid out in terms of concepts and topics, and then bringing those together. Now, one thing that is the thread throughout was the use of Spinoza by Spinoza of reason, which of course is a play in the title, a profession without reason. And for me, as I went through my experiences, it took me a little while to realize none of this makes sense. Not just what was happening to me, but not in terms of not getting help in the way I expected. And so, you mentioned in many places where he would use reason, that he wouldn't have needed some of the studies being done. And how do you see maybe reason and common sense? Do they play together? Are they the same? Are they different, just I'm partial to common sense. I make the joke that, since my name is Penny, the world needs more common sense. Sense. And if I rule the world, we'd have it more. But because I tend to use common sense as a phrase where reason came up a lot here. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, or.
Okay, well, reason by reason, it's for me synonymous with logic. So logic is like, well, if A equal 1 and B equal 2, A plus B equal 3, right? This is reason or logic. Common sense is like, if it's raining outside and you go out without an umbrella and a raincoat, you're going to get wet. I mean, so a big other term I use throughout the book is the whole idea of consensus reality, which sometimes this idea, this common sense that people have, like unfortunately in our society, there's a lot of things that people all agree on, that they commonly agree on, that's not sensible. That's not right. So, it sometimes, like the rain example, you would hope most people would agree on that. But other things, that the consensus reality of our society is that people who are acting in ways you really don't understand, like are having beliefs that you really think are crazy, or they're seeing things you don't see, that the common sense or consensus reality of our society is that they have a serious mental illness, maybe even brain disease, and on and on. So a lot of like what guys like real philosophers, real critical thinkers do, they're always confronting this kind of consensus reality, because they recognize historically, I mean, you've had in U.S. history, consensus reality was that slavery was a legitimate institution, and that a certain race was inferior to another race. This was common sense consensus reality. So like that's what real critical thinkers are doing. They're challenging everything. So everything's on the table, like including whether the whole institution of psychiatry can be reformed, or whether the whole thing, the basic core model of it, is so problematically wrong that it's impossible to reform it. So there's some of the differences. But back to the other point that you were making, which was Spinoza, like I would lay out in some things in that book, and here's the empirical evidence of why psychiatry is wrong. But let me tell you why Spinoza wouldn't have even needed it. And so one big example of that is in terms of the issue of stigmatization. And so we know, like, psychiatry has this idea, their anti-stigma campaign is, if we only make these, quote, serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia, quote, have the public believe that they're, quote, a disease like any other, right? A brain genetic disease here, that's going to lead to greater tolerance and more, less stigma. And we know from empirical research that that's not true. A guy there's lots and lots of studies, but a real significant reviewer of all those studies, a guy named John Reed, psychologist, who's looked at over 20 of these, more of these studies, and shown that to the extent that people believe that when people are moving into these states of having, delusions, or seeing things that other people aren't, and if they're labeled as biochemical, genetic, brain diseases, that it creates more stigma. People are more frightened of them. People want to stay away from them. People more believe it's permanent, and there's unpredictability and fright. Whereas if these things are labeled as just simply crises, resulting maybe from trauma, there's less stigma. So we have lots of research to show, empirical research to show this idea of psychiatry's destigmatization. It's not true. We also have history. We have, like, what I was talking about with homosexuality before. As soon as people stopped labeling homosexuality as a mental illness, it became less and less stigmatized. It was just seen as a normal human variation. So the idea of seeing phenomenon that people have never experienced before and viewing them as normal human variations rather than brain diseases is going to be way to destigmatize. So we know that. But as I was saying, a guy like Spinoza, it would have been obvious to him. He says, like, it's obvious to him. How could you, like, decide to coerce and control people, force them on medication because they've been labeled psychotic, and if they don't be on their medication, if they're not on their medication, they're going to be dangerous and unpredictable. How could you view somebody that way and say that that's going to be destigmatizing?
Right.
How could that even be? But like, again, I know in modern society they don't trust that logic and reason like a guy like Spinoza and his friends would have done. So they need to see the empirical evidence. And they need to see history. So I throw everything at them. I throw history, empirical
you really
evidence,
do.
And I said, if that doesn't convince you, if all of those things doesn't convince you that psychiatry don't know what the hell they're talking about in destigmatization, then I give up on you. You're basically a dogmatist. You're basically no different than somebody who's like attached to the literal truth of the Bible, and nothing's going to convince you otherwise.
You threw a lot in there when you said I'm going to throw it all at you. I'm like, because you did include both. And that's why, to me, the reason, and even as you describe common sense, I can understand what you're talking about kind of in terms of maybe a social common sense, consensus reality, but maybe I'm using common sense as that analytical, because I am analytical with my background. But I just wanted to explore that a little bit, because for me, there's just that part of that experience made no sense for me. And so it's just a play on things. So one thing, when I first saw the subtitle and you mentioned Spinoza, I would say that in our culture today, Spinoza is probably best known as it relates to the Albert Einstein quote, that someone asked Einstein if he believed in God. And I'm paraphrasing here, but the answer was, if by God you mean Spinoza's God, then yes. Did I get that gist
Pretty
correct?
much, right. That's pretty much the gist of it, right.
So, and you do go into, you talk about Spinoza's God. You don't call it that necessarily, but his version of God. And so what was God according to Spinoza?
Well, I think the first thing to say what God was not, okay? Which is like it's certainly not what most people think in our society, this kind of anthropomorphic, human-like big guy in the sky who, if you pray, who you can manipulate, with your prayers to get a hot date or win the lottery, or if you're doing things that he doesn't personally like, he's going to get you back. He's going to screw you up for it. He's going to throw you in hell. This is nothing to do this kind of anthropomorphic. And in fact, Spinoza, in one of his correspondence, he sort of makes fun of this kind of self-absorbed, narcissistic, anthropomorphic view. He says, if triangles were to talk about what they thought God was, God would be eminently triangular. So, so what is Spinoza's God? So we talk about what is not Spinoza's God. Certainly, God, not that God of the Ten Commandments, like in the movie, that God who you hear this voice telling Moses what to do. It's not that. What God for Spinoza is, he uses the phrase actually God or nature. So I think most this is not controversial among Spinoza scholars. Some of the things are, but this is not that God and nature are one for Spinoza. Okay, and so by nature, he certainly means what most people commonly call nature: the birds, the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees. And you, Penny, are God, and I'm God. He means all that, but he means also to the laws of nature. So E = MC squared, everything. Basically, all of reality for Spinoza is God. So this is why some people have said that he is a pantheist. Okay, this is what some of the idea that this Spinoza guy is a pantheist is a pretty common attribution to him. Some folks now, Spinoza would say, like, heck no, I'm not a pantheist. You guys just have the wrong idea of God. That's what he would say. God is just one thing here, and he has this whole, in his ethics and his other writings, makes this clear, deductive, logical explanation of why his view of God is correct. He has this geometric Euclidean, book where he describes it. Sometimes people also say, like, wait a minute, this is BS. Spinoza was really an atheist. So people make the argument that there's a German poet, the guy named Novalis, who said, no, he was a God-intoxicated man because he talked about the intellectual love of God all the time. So in terms of his view of God, he loved God. So there's always intellectual, so he's a God, God-intoxicated man, an atheist, a pantheist. And Spinoza, part of the reason why some folks would say, and some Spinoza scholars, one of the probably most famous Spinoza scholars in the world, a guy named Stephen Nadler, says, like, you know what, I think he's an atheist, really, because, and this is his view, that because he viewed, like when you think of theism and atheism, you're thinking about worship. You're thinking about you worship this God. And Nadler's case is that he's not worshiping anybody, Spinoza. His view of God is that you understand through reason and logic. And the more that you grasp this God, the more that you literally love this God, it's vitalizing, it's empowering, because you become connected to something larger. But that's not for a guy like, a guy like Nadler, that's not a theistic worshiping kind of thing. It's much more of a reasoning scientific thing. So you can see that's part of the really interesting thing about a guy like Spinoza. Depending on what your language is and depending on how you think about things, you could see how everybody can make an interesting case for their point of view on him.
It sounds like it. As you were describing that, it was like, again, people can't agree. Depending on the
Right.
angle you look at somebody,
Right.
you get a different perception, and that's your perception. Now, it's and I wouldn't be able to find it right now in the book, but there was some discussion around, you mentioned nature, the laws of nature, but what I took from it is that there was still an openness to recognizing that there are things about nature we don't understand. Am I paraphrasing
Absolutely.
that? Okay.
Absolutely. That's part of one of the great side effects, positive side effects of Spinoza's God, because it forces humility. I mean, you cannot be an arrogant, know-it-all if you're in this Spinozistic world. People disagree on all kinds of things, but part of being in this kind of Spinozic world is once you understand that God is everything and human beings are only one mode of this God thing, that you recognize, how arrogant is anybody to say with utter certainty that they know everything here, that it's very easy for people to kind of miss certain things. So it sort of compels a kind of a humility. It doesn't compel people, it compels people to be really pursuing greater and greater truths, more and more evidence, more and more rationality, because you know that the more that you get to these truths of what God or nature or what reality really is, it's empowering and vitalizing, but it compels a certain kind of humility. And this is why Einstein loved him. And that's one of the early reasons why I got interested in Spinoza, was that wow, the greatest scientist of the 27th century, or what most people think is, he said the God of Spinoza is my God. So what the heck was that all about? And part of it was exactly what I was just describing there.
So as you described that kind of that bigness, that openness, a phrase popped into my head related to my own experiences, which goes to spiritual awakening, the opening of the psyche. And I think that's part of why I recognize what you're describing here. But but there's also that element of, I'll use the phrase oneness, that comes up from time to time. And you hear about it, we are all one. There's the Gaia principle or the Gaia theory. There's the Tao out of the Eastern religions, that type of thing. Is that kind of what Spinoza, how do you have a feel for how those play together, or is that?
Yes. No, that's part of why a lot of folks he's one of the few Western philosophers that a lot of folks who are like more into Eastern thought and some of the other things that you're talking about are attracted to him, because he was in direct contrast. This was a break from one of the first so-called Enlightenment thinkers, rationalists, a guy named Descartes, who was very dualistic. Mm-hmm. And Spinoza said, like, no, everything is one. And that's why, again, Einstein was forever looking for this kind of unified field theory of trying to connect all the dots together in one thing. And so a lot of what's also interesting about folks, and I get into another kind of controversy, this is why some people view Spinoza as a mystic, because some people define mysticism as like how you can connect with the oneness of the universe. And he certainly did do that kind of, he thought it was a great idea to connect with the oneness of the universe. But other folks say, like, yeah, that's true. But when you use words like mystic, it conveys a kind of religious, kind of non-rational sense. And Spinoza wasn't really that kind of guy. So it's interesting how, like, he was sort of like a rationalistic mystic. Okay.
I mean, I'm going to start using that. Because, of course, for me, mysticism, I distinguish between mysticism and religion. Mm-hmm. So, or spirituality and religion, that religion is the framework. And obviously, I'm not, mysticism is in my YouTube channel title. So for me, mystic isn't a bad thing, but I understand how it has different meanings as well. Right. And so I think, but because the other one I forgot to mention in terms of the Tao, Gaia, the oneness, is people also call it quantum, not in terms of quantum physics, but this quantum interconnectivity. And again, that concept's been around for a while. That would have helped me back in '98.
Right. No, in the chapter that I said, there's a chapter that I didn't think I was going to write before I delve deeper and deeper into Spinoza. But the one chapter is called is about madness and scientia intuitive, which is intuitive knowledge, which maybe we could talk a little bit more about that later. But in that, I saw how his idea of, like, what do we call monism, non-dualism, oneness of the universe, how a lot of that kind of, if you understand that, that's one of the reasons. There's many, many ways to sort of understand what psychiatry calls serious mental illness, psychoses, or whatever you want to call it. And psychiatry's views are just totally boring and not right. But once you move into all these other realms, they become much more interesting and they make sense for some people. So there's about three big reasons in that chapter, but one of the ones that a guy named Paris Williams, who has written, I see you're shaking
I'm
your head,
familiar with them. Yeah, but go
Paris,
ahead,
who's
please.
written about madness. He's written about that. He talks about, like, a big thing from his experience in terms of interviewing a lot of people who've, like, whatever went into these altered states, is that they've struggled with this thing about, like, well, how am I this individual apart from the world, but at some intuitive level I know that I'm together with this whole thing. And so this whole duality individuation thing, especially for young people, especially if they've had a lot of other trauma and stress, it just flips them out, it snaps them. And for your kind of basic psychiatrist who's not really thinking about all these heavy things, they're really kind of boring, sort of limited, narrow people. Well, like, how could that be such a big deal for some people? But it is. And the difference in for guys like Spinoza and Einstein, it didn't flip them out because they had a lot more confidence in their intellect, that they realized, oh yeah, the thing is, there is a oneness to the universe, but I am walking around different and individual, and I'm of course I'm working that issue out, how I could be an individual in this one universe and all that sort of stuff. But for a lot of other folks, according, Paris goes into this whole theory of this whole thing of, like, for a lot of other folks, that just snaps them, that just freaks them out.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the ways I describe it is more of an ego collapse. And if you think of the ego as the structure between the subconscious and conscious, and that came through a moral injury, that I look at someone like Spinoza and Einstein, and yeah, I'm sure they went through their trauma, but there wasn't a specific thing that knocked that apart, So, and for me, it was one of the best things that, yeah, I mean, it hurt like hell, but there's a lot of material. And I actually equate, I use the hero's journey a lot, that I went from a known realm into an unknown realm. And part of the problem is that the experts, so-called experts, only understood the known realm. They'd never made that journey themselves. And not that you have to make that journey in order to be helpful, but you should at least acknowledge there's something else out there. And so because of that, because of that, then when you try and come back from that unknown realm into the known realm, it's not an inviting place, is one of the ways I describe it. So it's interesting because I'm familiar with Paris's work. I actually came across his book at a thrift store about a year ago, and I haven't read it yet. But and to me, it's interesting because you'd mentioned language earlier, and I can tell, I have a second master's in German, and so kind of the linguistics and stuff, and you can tell there's a slightly, even sometimes just a slightly different language that people who have the experience use that others don't. So, but no, I appreciate your take on the Spinoza's God, because again, quantum, that ties into quantum physics. And my understanding is that even Carl Jung reached out to Einstein, and I forget the other one, with his theory of synchronicity. And Einstein encouraged him, but Jung had to wait until the quantum theory kind of took hold enough.
Right. One of the fun things about the biggest thing in that, why I call that chapter Madness and Scientia Intuitiva, is one of the more fun things, at least for me. Maybe I'm delusional and crazy. We'll see. We'll see about that. But one of the fun things for me was that if you understand, like, Spinoza's epistemology, his theories of knowledge, okay, that's really all that means, is that he has it ranked, like, the lowest form of knowledge for him is just anecdotal, hearsay, somebody else's opinion. It's not worthless, but it is not to be trusted. The second level, which is more to be trusted, is what he calls, reason, logic, like what we were talking about before. But the highest level, and this is one of the more interesting concepts in Spinoza world, that it's sort of a little bit not as clear for a lot of Spinoza scholars exactly what he meant by this, but some things are clear, is the highest form is something he calls intuitive knowledge. And it's what's clear, uncontroversial, Spinoza clearly states this is the highest form of knowledge. This is where you get to the greatest truths. And so, and basically what this intuitive knowledge, what he doesn't say a lot about, but he says a few things about it. It's basically his understanding of, once you understand his God somewhat, this nature, you understand the way the whole world works at some level, you go to specific things and you have this instant flashes, okay, without any need to do any kind of logic, okay, and deductive thought, that it just like things just hit you as like, this is true. This is like, you get these intuitive grasps. And the fun thing for me was comparing Albert Einstein, who totally bought this, totally said, like, almost all his great discoveries, his Nobel Prize winning stuff, all his genius things, his 1905 year where he came up with just one gigantic thing after another, they all came to him first with these intuitive flashes. But he had the humility to say, like, well, just because something hits me, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. And a lot of these things turned out to be true when he did the math on them, did the logic and all of when you then, and I compared Einstein to John Nash, the guy from A Beautiful Mind, who also just totally believed in his intuitions as being, truths of God. When he'd have an intuition, he just clung to it. And so, like, well, one of his intuitions did win the Nobel Prize. I mean, his game theory, but a lot of his other intuitions were like things like, well, hyper rational extraterrestrials were telling him how he had to save the world and stuff like that. And so, one of the more interesting conversations, by the way, I should tell folks, if you really want to read the truth of John Nash, the movie has the only truth is in the movie. Well, there's limited truths in the movie. There's a lot of lies actually in the movie. Yeah. But the book, if you read Sylvia Nasser's book, which has the same title, Beautiful Mind, you find some interesting things. And one of the interesting pieces I found in there was, at some point, Nash is confronted by some other prof, some Harvard prof, and says, John, how could a smart guy like you believe these extraterrestrials are being sent to you to like save? How could that be? And Nash just says back to him, he says, well, these thoughts came to me the same way that I got Nash's equilibrium theory, the thing that won me a Nobel Prize, and I trusted them both. And so in some ways, you can make like the difference between, what's the difference between Nash and Einstein? Well, one, for me, and this is just my own opinion, is that because Nash so needed to be great, so needed to be famous. Actually, nobody in his 20s really appreciated the brilliance of that equilibrium theory, and he had other stresses, and his life was a mess, and there were so many other traumas and stresses that he psychologically was more likely to just attach himself to whatever intuition came through him. Whereas a guy like Einstein would go like, hey, that's an interesting thing going through my mind. I'd check it out. And he would do that with other people too. Anything. You could tell him the craziest thing in the world, Einstein. He would go, that's interesting. Let's talk about that rationally and logically, like a real scientist would do, as opposed to somebody in the American Psychiatric Association. They hear anything they disagree with, they're like religious dogmatists. They just totally condemn you as a menace to society or something like that. Yeah. But so in a way, so what I started to understand was that once you, and real artists and scientists and lots of people appreciate the value of this intuitive knowledge. They may never have read Spinoza, but at some level they go, that's how you get to the highest form of great truths, okay? Which is what Spinoza realized. But some people have a little bit more humility about their intuitions than others.
Yeah, I look at it as Einstein didn't have an ego collapse and John Nash did.
Okay.
That's how I look at it.
Okay.
Because a few years after my experience is when A Beautiful Mind came out. And to be honest with you, I didn't care much for the movie. I mean, I understood what they were trying to present, but I was like, nah, that doesn't do it for me. But I did come across the book, and I actually haven't read the book, but I bought it because of that quote on the back. John, how could you believe in such things? And the answer is it came from the same source. And so in this deluge of information, to me, it goes to the Rumi quote that says the wound is where the light enters you. Mm-hmm. So there's a chink in that ego and then the light, and there were massive wounds. And so for me, that was part of it. But I also want to make sure we touch on one thing in the movie that was not correct, is that how John Nash recovered from those non-ordinary states of consciousness was he weaned himself off of the medications.
Right. One of the most famous lie, and this is an outright lie in the movie that people have talked about a lot, well, at least in the critical psychiatry, critical psychology, people like Robert Whitaker and myself, we talked about this stuff a lot. It's a big deal. Was that in the movie, people might remember if they've seen it, he's sort of getting vetted by the Nobel Prize Committee because they're afraid he's going to go crazy and embarrass them. And they're trying to figure out, like, well, how do you get your act together? And there's a line in that movie that where he says, I'm taking the newer medications, okay, which is a total lie. And in the book, it makes clear he stopped taking the medications by the 1970s. There's interviews on YouTube that I hyperlink to all the time, and where you could hear Matt Nash. I mean, he's a pretty chill, mellow guy before he died in a car accident, where he wouldn't get all upset about it because that stuff's just not true. And so, and clearly, and when you read the book, you see like that they actually, these psychiatrists, these insane, violent psychiatrists, were wanting to give him electroshock, and his wife and his sister are very proud of themselves that they fought psychiatry off, because they said part of how he made his comeback, he still had his brain intact and he could still do math and do all the things that he really cared about. And that would have been destroyed by the electroshock. This is what his sister and his wife said. So there's, the only basic truth of the movie was, that it was helpful for John to have some support. His supportive wife helped, and some of the supportive community there in Princeton that they have in the movie. That's true. So but most of the other stuff about in that movie is what a lot of people. The Guardian did a piece a bunch of years back that they claim, that I don't know this for a fact, but that the screenwriter for the A Beautiful Mind, he had one or both of his parents were mental health professionals, and he had a sense that if we told the truth about the Beautiful Mind, about how John Nash got his act together without medication, that would get everybody to go off their medication. That would be such a horrible thing, and told Ron Howard and blah blah blah. And clearly, my gut tells me if that movie had really displayed the truth of like how he had gotten his act together, John Nash, it would not have won an Academy Award. It may not have even gotten made, because it would have been pissed off the whole mental health establishment that came to really love and support that movie.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that element. I too had heard that it was someone involved with the movie. Their mother was a psychologist.
Right.
And there was concern. But that actually touches on, I never took the medications. I said, hey, give me a chance to figure this out. So I didn't have to deal with that part of it. But my understanding is that part of the concern is that people going off their medications cold turkey, which can be very dangerous. Correct? I mean, that.
Right.
And I mean, that's why I want to mention it here.
That might have been. But the interesting thing for me was, it's like, why did you have to put that line in there at all? Why couldn't you just instead of just lying and say I took the new medication? Why even deal with that issue? Okay, if you're afraid of it. So it was almost like you inserted a product placement for drug companies in that movie unnecessarily, rather than not talking about that issue here if you were, you didn't want to. So it was definitely, for me, it's one of those things that is kind of, I know from a lot of ex-patient psychiatric survivors, people in altered states, and also critics of psychiatry. It's kind of an enraging thing that went into that movie. And evidently, when I talk about it with other folks who are film experts, they tell me Ron Howard's done a lot of that kind of stuff in a lot of his other movies as well, to make things more politically palatable, make things more politically correct, so that a lot of, again, the big theme for me is that a lot of what goes on in life out there has nothing to do with science, truth, and justice. It has to do with politics. And people who get ahead, whether they're presidents of the American Psychiatric Association or Ron Howard, they're pretty politically astute.
And to me, that it brings back to the part of our initial conversation of where are we at in terms of in terms of reform, or in terms of change, that by presenting that false material, it makes it more difficult for those of us who didn't need the medication, and for me, part of the frustration I had is I was made to feel like I'm some kind of outlier for having made it through without the medication. And then you come across some of these studies where it's like, no, I'm in the majority.
Right,
You mentioned
right.
John Reed and some of these other
Right,
studies.
and that's what Robert Whitaker. Without Robert Whitaker, the whole world would not know about the Harrow Job studies,
Right.
and the other kind of longitudinal studies that show that people who've been off, aren't on medication, they do like 5 times better, than people who are on in the long term, and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there's just lots of think cover-ups that just go on, and that in the whole psychiatric profession, because there's these financial political interests that keep it that way.
Right. And so this actually, I'm looking at the time and just kind of, winding down. And that actually brings us to, how do things stand today, which we've really kind of touched on. And early we did mention that you are sensing that there is, it is easier to find criticizers and critiquers, or I consider myself someone, hey, we need better. Well, let me ask you this. Do we need a better model? I mean, there's the biomedical model, there's the chemical imbalance model, there's the biopsychosocial model. Do we need a more flexible model? As for me, just coming into this discussion, it's hard to know where to jump in because there's so much
Right.
goofiness. But what do you think in terms of bringing about change? What are some of the most important things that someone like myself could be advocating for?
Well, the biochemical model and the brain disease model, these are all part of the biomedical model. Okay, so psychiatry, if they got rid of the idea that emotional suffering, behavioral disturbances was not fundamentally related to some sort of brain biochemical biomedical thing, they put themselves out of business along with drug companies. So what they've done, the more kind of whatever you want to call it, open-minded, they'll always talk about stuff about it being that they really are not. These people like Levine are they're wrong when they accuse us of just having this biochemical medical model. We believe in a biological, psychological, social model, a biopsychosocial model. They'll say that all over the place. But the bottom line is all their research, if you take a look at National Institute of Mental Health, all their treatments, they're all biomedical, chemical, electrical. So yeah, they'll talk about, and Insel will talk about in that 2022 book, all kinds of sort of social reasons. And of course, they all think therapy, psychotherapy is a good idea, blah, blah, blah. So they all talk about that. But at core for them, this is a medical disease here. This is a medical issue here. And like other medical issues, yeah, psychology and social stuff has something to do with it. And the idea for them that they're fundamentally wrong here, this idea that a lot of what they're calling disease and illness and disorder are human variations, and are part of what it means to be a human being, and that certain phenomena obviously causes a person and others around them, some degree of suffering, but it doesn't necessarily mean that something is a disease or a defect. Okay, that's a fundamental thing that they'll never buy into, because if they do, that's their whole profession.
Well, and it's interesting with the talk of illness, because one of the things I look at is we don't talk about the social illness that a person might be dealing with, whether it's, child abuse, whether it's poverty, whether it's, and the stress that cause, which relates more to trauma than a biological cause. Just from what I see, there is more focus now on trauma, because like I was diagnosed without any kind of adequate assessment of my past history of trauma, of my current environment. And it seems like any diagnosis made without adequate consideration of those things should be null and void.
Right. And so again, one of the strengths of this movement is like unburying things that have been buried. So, for zillions of years, even Freud knew about the importance of trauma, and a lot of folks who were like old time psychoanalytic, but it all got buried again more and more, especially by drug companies and biopsychiatry and all of that. So it wasn't like this new discovery, but in the 1990s, the famous, well, it should be famous, the adverse childhood experience study was done on the over 17,000 Kaiser Permanente patients. And it was clear that people who had a lot of trauma by them, they all got like a score, a 10-point score of, if you had child abuse, you had physical abuse, physical neglect, emotional abuse, you had say, parents who went to prison and on and on. So if you had these significant traumatic things, it was highly associated with later major problems, from being an IV drug user to being morbidly obese to being suicidal, all those things. So it should have been obvious stuff. But it took forever for folks to fight to get that stuff back out there again. And now I would say probably every other psychologist would call themselves trauma informed, whatever the hell that means. I don't know how good they are at dealing with trauma, but it's now politically correct. It's not a radical thing to say I'm trauma informed. I mean, it costs you nothing to say something like that. But again, for me, some of the, when you're talking about the social political aspects of that, one thing I try to talk a lot about is that, like, in that Kaiser study, for example, like 30% of the 25% of the women, and these are middle class, upper middle class women, reporting, a sexual abuse. And God knows what the numbers were, probably higher than that, really. And 30% of the young guy, all the men in the study were reporting physical abuse. And so for me, the important political social question is, like, why is that going on in our society? Why is there so much sexual abuse? Why is there so much physical abuse, emotional abuse here? Is that related to the whole nature of our economic system and blah blah blah? And I get into detail on that in other areas, but I think part of, like, my, I don't know, contempt, disgust, embarrassment with the whole field is that they keep burying stuff that are obvious common sense, and we have to work like hell to get them unburied, and never get into, like, really being real thinkers here about what number one are the real causes of things and what we can do about them.
And as you were talking about that phrase common sense was coming up as you were talking about the ACE study. So we had talked earlier about that, but this is where truly common sense in terms of what is going on.
Right. It's now common sense again.
Yeah. And burying or ignoring all of that is not common sense.
Right.
Yeah. And that's why when you said common sense, I was like, aha.
Right. No, it's a funny thing, because if you bury something that was once common sense, it's still common sense, because it's not commonly held. It should be common sense.
Yeah. And so, but I enjoy watching threads come together like that. My name isn't Penelope, but Penny is derived from Penelope. And one of the theories is the Greek version of Penelope. It's come from the Greek meaning weaver or bobbin. And so I love following those threads and how they come looping back around. So so I'm looking at time, and I do want to wind it up. So I do have one question is, you've been doing this for a long time, in terms of your first book, I think was published, was it 2001, 2003? And you've written a lot about, authoritarianism and, the power dynamics that we talked a little bit about. How do you not burn out?
Well, I think the reason why people burn out in general is that they're letting themselves be controlled, and they're controlling other folks. Now, I should say, some folks in job situations or family situations, they have no choice. They're getting controlled. They're not letting themselves. They have no choice. But for a lot of folks, I think that those are key elements for me. I see, like, for example, a lot of just doctors out there, left and right, are all burning out. Why? Because they're being controlled by their practice, big giant corporate practices, by insurance companies, and they're being forced to control people. They're being forced to ask questions of patients that they have no respect for. I see that all the time with primary care docs. So you see the same kind of thing with teachers, and certainly there's a lot of other folks who aren't in these so-called more prestigious white-collar jobs that are getting burned out. And so for me, I understand that, and I'm lucky enough, doing what I do here, that where the people I write for these days, I write for a lot of different places. Just in the past, mostly I'm writing these days for Counterpunch, and which is a sort of a left anti-authoritarian publication, Political, and then Mad in America, and a few other places. And nobody's trying to control me there for the most part. Nobody's censored me yet, and I'm not trying. And the big thing for me is I'm not really trying to control the way the universe works here. I'm in my own head. It's like, I'm happy to, like, run into people who are open-minded, and sometimes for me, the most satisfying thing is people who already get it. There's people who are watching our show, this podcast, Penny, who they intuitively, they already got almost everything that we're saying. They're just going like, yeah, I knew that. But they need some validation. They need some validation from somebody like you who's been through these altered states, who's come out the other end. They need some validation from a guy like me, because I, got some letters after my name. And so that's fun. Talking to people who are open-minded, who are critically thinking, who are free thinking kind of people. And, are those people ever been the majority in the history of society? I don't think so. I don't know. I don't know if they're like 5% or 10% or 20%, but I'm pretty sure they've never been in the majority. But and so for me, I've sort of accepted that that's what's satisfying for me. And every once in a while, miraculously for me, that our movement has an impact on society at large. So for example, like the latest thing was, after talking about railing about this chemical imbalance theory being bullshit for years, for whatever reason, in 2022, Joanna Moncrief, her article in the Journal of Molecular Psychiatry, this obscure journal, breaks through to the mainstream, and all of a sudden, everybody, it's on CBS News, and it breaks through. And now, there's these things that we have pulled off, we have accomplished, and for me, that's sort of like great. That's sort of icing on the cake. But for me, what keeps me going is just stuff like this. It's fun that I know that there's going to be a few people who are going to be watching this stuff, and they're just going to become more whole and more energized off of our discussion.
Well, that's awesome, because and the reason I asked that is because I've seen you in other interviews, and there's obviously a passion there, which is fantastic. It was hard for me to get into this. I really had to focus on healing my nervous system, because there's that feeling of going up against something so big. And, having been traumatized all those years ago, there's some of that stuff in the depth of the psyche. And so that's why coming across, people like yourself that have that passion and for so long is pretty impressive to me. So I just want to say thank you. Hey, I forgot to mention this morning, I always have a cup of water when I interview somebody, just to, I purposely brought my Einstein mug. I don't have a Spinoza mug, and I thought, well, this will get me close enough. So, so Bruce, I just want to say thank you. And again, this is the latest book, A Profession Without Reason, and I'll include a link to your website, brucelevine.net. Right. Did I get that right? And then, how can people get a copy?
They can get, if they go on the website, they'll see it. Just the normal ways you could get it. If you Amazon, if you hate Amazon. Most people who read my books do, but you can go directly to the publisher. You can order it from bookstores or whatever. Just the normal ways people would end up getting get books. Yeah,
and so they could order it directly from your website.
Not directly from my website, but if you go to my website, there's a book section, and that will link you to all those different places.
Okay,
right,
great.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. This has been fun.
I've enjoyed it as well.